This week I'm joined by James Franklin, who is the author of The Science of Conjecture, Evidence and Probability Before Pascal, Corrupting the Youth, A History of Philosophy in Australia, What Science Knows, and other books. In this episode we discuss the life and legacy of philosopher David Stove, alongside discussions on woke culture, Marxism, equality, empiricism, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid subscribers and patrons for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support the podcast for as little as $1 a month and keep it going indefinitely, then please find links in the description below. It really does go a long way. Otherwise, please enjoy. James Franklin, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast. We are going to be discussing the work of a fairly obscure Australian philosopher called David Stove, who people, if they've heard of him, will know him for his work, The Plato Cult and Other Philosophical Follies, Popper and After for Modern Irrationalists, and his work on David Hume and his work on induction. But also they might know of him for his sort of the 70s and 80s, his seemingly controversial opinions on essays sort of titled, The Intellectual Capacity of Women and things such as these. He's really a progenitor, maybe you might disagree with this, James, a progenitor to people such as Jordan Peterson or the sort of woke, the critics of woke culture today. But before we jump in with Stove and his work, just tell us a little about yourself, and also, how it was I believe you're the literary executor of David Stove's work, and how you came to know him as well.
Yes, I'm James Franklin. I was a student of David Stove in philosophy at Sydney University in the 1970s, and I knew him well later. He left me as his literary executor when he died in 1994. I pursued an academic career in mathematics, philosophy, and the history of ideas. In the course of that, I wrote a book called Corrupting the Youth, A History of Philosophy in Australia, which was partly based on my first-hand experience of philosophy with Stove and others.
So, I mean, maybe a little quick question before we do go into the other questions. I mean, is there a distinctive reason that you could sort of consider it Australian philosophy? Does Stove fall into that as well? Is there something in the psyche
yes,
which
that's right.
which changes the philosophical foundations?
Well, we say that we say that the harsh light here gets rid of some of the foggier European thought forms, and that we're more realist and more sceptical. I think that's especially true of Sydney more than Melbourne. We're rather proud of our scepticism and hard-headedness here, and Stove certainly falls into that.
Okay. In the midst of the heat, you don't have time for postmodern nonsense.
That's right. Having said that, there is too much postmodernism that's come in here, along with a number of other overseas fads, but we try to ignore that where possible.
Okay. Well, I'm sure postmodernism will probably come in later on, but before we do jump in with Stove and his work, I do have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. And I forgot to add here, as we're talking about David Stove, he's already in the room, and you can add 3 more in. Who do you pick?
Okay. Well, my pick would be Aristotle, Archimedes, and Descartes. But in one way, I think the question doesn't make much sense. I mean, if you put any 3 geniuses like that in a room, I guarantee you won't get a conversation at all. You'll get 3 monologues that soon turn heated as they hector one another on where they've gone wrong. It could well come to blows.
So you don't think there's many philosophers who aren't just out for themselves in a certain sense, who wouldn't just jump straight into their own thoughts?
Well, they're not out for themselves. It's just that they have a rather high sense of their own genius. That's what makes them distinctive and famous philosophers. The same as, I suppose, distinctive and famous political leaders. You've got to have a very strong sense of self-importance, and that doesn't go too well, by and large, with a good sense of listening or sense of conversation. That's my sense. It's possible that you could get geniuses that talk to each other very politely. I just can't think of any instances.
So you think maybe the reality would probably be, if you asked them to do this, they'd probably say, look, why are you wasting my time?
Why are other people wasting our time? Just listen to me, son. Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying now to think of examples of maybe humble or timid philosophers, but there's very few. Maybe
Yeah.
Kierkegaard.
In a way, yes, that's right. Yeah. But then that meant he took his football away and did it by himself. So yeah, but that's true. That's true. There are some like that don't hector other people, but you don't by and large hear of them.
No, not until long after they've left us. Okay. Well, I like that answer. I like that answer to the question. But I mean, just in so Aristotle, Archimedes, and Descartes. So I get the sense from David Stove and from yourself that, and I guess maybe I'm right in thinking here as well with what you've said about Australian philosophy, that to tie that all together. Maybe this sounds ridiculous in relation to Europe, but I've studied continental philosophy, so I'm allowed to say this. You're people who are still taking philosophy serious in that very quote unquote old sense of a pursuit for truth.
Yes, not universally, but if you go and study philosophy at an Australian university, even today, you will find people who are taking that very seriously. You'll find people who are undermining it as well. But we do have preserved a tradition of doing philosophy in the older style.
Where did we go wrong? Where was the big turn where philosophy went wrong?
Where was the big turn? There are so many places where it could have you could have said we shouldn't go down that path. But as we'll mention later in the interview, David Stove thought that excessive politeness to Marxism from the 60s or so was the first turn, and it opened the way to others like too much French theory, and then postmodernism, and then race and class and gender and so on, and each of those built on the wrong turn before and made an even further wrong turn.
Okay. Well, I guess it's time to ask the question. I mean, who was David Stove, and I guess why are we talking about it?
Well, David Stove was an Australian conservative philosopher of around the 1980s. He was known for arguments against a number of received ideas such as the intellectual equality of men and women, against mainstream Popperian philosophy of science, against sociobiology and others. He was against left-wing ideas of all kinds. His arguments are a little different from the usual arguments against those views. They're more based on logical moves than on factual evidence. He also made some positive contributions to the theory of probability and induction, and he's often admired for his prose style.
So yeah, I mean, I guess just to tie it in, because from what I'd read, as you said, he's against left-wing arguments, which brings in the Marxist, Foucault, postmodern stuff. His prose style is very straightforward. As I understand it, I mean, to maybe define his own philosophy within, known philosophical movements, he's more leaning towards logical positivism.
I suppose you'd say that. Yeah, more, I guess, classical empiricism in the style of David Hume. I mean, David Hume was the philosopher he most admired, even though he thought he'd gone wrong some places. It's more philosophy continuous with science. He thinks that science is pretty right and gives us as complete a picture of the world as you're going to get. And philosophical additions are not adding anything to the combination of science and common sense.
So what would have he considered philosophy that really has fallen off these tracks towards a teleology of truth, of working out how we know what we know, of these very grand philosophical visions? What would he consider philosophy that's now I don't know, treading in all kinds of just useless waters?
Yes, well, he thought that anything that attempted to undermine science, for example, starting with Popper and going on to more postmodernist and sociological views of science, had just headed off completely on the wrong track. And you could see that just because they called in question the logic of science. And he said you could learn about the logic of science from probability theory and also from looking at scientists and their practice, but you couldn't learn it by any so-called deep philosophical theories or any underminings on the grounds that theory is determined by evidence or something like that.
So would there ever be a time or a point for Stove where he might say, okay, it's legitimate for philosophers now to shake up the waters and question these forms of understanding, forms of knowing the truth scientifically?
Well, no, and because he thought that you could see what the logic of science was. It's just the logic of probability, and that's open to inspection the way that deductive logic is, like the syllogism. And you know that, and that there isn't any possibility of undermining it because it's necessarily true. It's a necessary logical fact.
I mean, I've got to say, James, I'm almost in this strange position as someone who's, and I'm not anti-continental. I think it's all very enjoyable and great to read, right? But I'm in this strange position of not having a conversation for a long time where there is this just a position where you say, look, this is fact, this is what we know, this is, and there's a point where something isn't questioned. And I guess maybe Stove is refreshing. It was refreshing to read Stove in the sense that it's the first time in a long time I hadn't just entered into the question of relativism. Of everything being relative.
Right. Well, perhaps you're not mixing in the right circles. You need to get a job as a bottle washer in a lab or something where they do take seriously experimental evidence and its relation to theory. You should get out more.
Yeah, but I should get out more. Yeah, yeah, definitely. But I mean, there's even philosophers who would question, bottle washing in a lab. That the context of a lab could alter the results, right? The cultural context of a lab could alter the results of scientific findings and things along these lines.
There's some level of level where that might be true, but at the bottom level, it really isn't. There's if you've washed the bottle, it's basically empty, or it basically isn't. We've got the ordinary evidence that we use for getting around the world, like has the bus come on time or hasn't it? Well, these are not facts to be undermined by theory, and there's in a sense cultural context of them, but the cultural context has to be sensitive to the fact that at the bottom level observations are solid.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a question. I'll just ask. I mean, perhaps Stove opened up on this in times, but I'll ask yourself as well. Why do you think philosophy? We've just continued down this road where, we are questioning everything. We've entered into relativism, and we just keep going down there. We just keep opening things up.
I have some doubts about this we. Again, perhaps that's because I have had my academic career in a science faculty. And the we that's in the science faculty don't do that. To us in science faculties, all this talk about relativism in the humanities department over the way has washed off us like water off a duck's back. We've hardly noticed it. And if philosophers would like to come and see us and talk to us about it, and especially maybe in a mathematics school where I actually live, we're not relativists. No, we've proved things and they've stayed proved. And you can, if you want to be relativist about the conclusions, well, come and see us and we'll put the proof in front of you. And if you don't understand it, well, you should stop talking about it. And if you do understand it, you'll be convinced.
Do you still sort of engage with philosophy of science or philosophy of mathematics?
I do myself. So I've written a book on philosophy of mathematics called An Aristotelian Realist Philosophy of Mathematics, which says that mathematics does give you certain truths which are directly applicable to the real physical world. Again, that's a little bit of a minority view, I must say. But that is what I argue for.
Okay, but perhaps I'll rephrase my question, and I'll try be a bit more particular of language and not include the grand we,
the royal we, yes,
the royal we,
right.
like politicians.
We humanists is not the same thing as we scientists.
We the people.
We who agree with me.
Yeah. Why do you? Okay, so in a sense, then we could say we have those two sides. We have the side that you're working in where the scientific faculties have stuck to provable truths which come from deductions and basically facts, eventually proven facts. And on the other side, you have the relativists within the humanities. Why do you think it is that in the West,
Yes, well, it's quite true that the humanities world, including in academia, maybe especially in academia, has been taken over by those relativist ways of thinking. I wouldn't say 100%, but certainly they're dominant. So why that happened is a sociological and historical question that's not very easy to resolve. There must be some moral reasons for it. I mean, why did people want to believe those things? And there's a rise of resentment and identity politics that has to be explained by non-rational reasons, because it doesn't have rational reasons in favour of it. What those are, well, it has to be somehow the same appeal as Marxism had in the mid-century, that there's something morally attractive about resentment and thinking you're on the side of the oppressed or something if you undermine the usual ways of thinking that you represent as somehow oppressive, or devices for the ruling class to oppress you and those you purport to be acting on behalf of. It's a very confused way of thinking, and I can't really think myself into it. In fact, I think you may, in fact, be better, having been where you've been, you might be better to do the diagnosis.
Okay, wow. No, I think I would agree with everything you've said, really. I mean, ultimately, it's difficult to discern factually because it's not in the realm of facts, it's in the realm of emotions and opinion. So, you can't really discern the truth because they haven't begun from a foundation of truth. So it's very difficult to find your way. But that being said, one intriguing thing with Stove, despite his very empirical, as you say, classical empiricist philosophy, is that he does have, I would say, from everything I read from Plato Cult and from Cricket and Cricket versus Republicanism, which is a fantastic collection of essays, he does have a sympathy for the biographies of philosophers to the extent where this seems actually a very important thing for Stove regarding a philosopher's work. I mean, would you say that's true?
Yes. Well, his view is that if someone's view is reasonable, it's explained by the reasons for it, and there's no need to consider biographical data. But if someone is talking obvious nonsense, there must be some biographical or maybe biochemical cause for it, since there aren't reasons to explain it. So you can ask if there might be some such causes in someone's biography. For example, if their political philosophy is based on resentment, you might ask if they believe that their self-evident massive talents weren't recognised by a cruel and heartless society. Yeah, so he says biographical evidence is relevant when there's nonsense to be explained, because what else is there to explain it?
Okay. But if someone's got fairly sound philosophy, then
but if they've laid out, even if they're wrong, if they've got laid out some serious reasons that make some sense, well, that's why they think it, and you can take the reasons seriously and address them as a reasonable person. But if they're not, well, you have to deconstruct, as they now say.
Just maybe perhaps just as an example, because Popper is probably the philosopher that gets the most flack from Stove. I mean, what was what were the sort of biographical reasons here for Popper's idiocy?
Well, he didn't mind actually Popper's political views, but Popper was well known as being anti-authoritarian in theory, but very authoritarian in practice. And so again, I think Stove thought that his undermining of science by his thinking that science couldn't establish the truth. So Popper thinks that Popper thinks in effect that a scientific theory can be falsified. That is, you can show it's false, but you can't show it's true by experimental evidence. And not only that, you can't show it's more probable than it was before by experimental evidence, which is a seriously irrational point of view. And what the biographical reasons could you think of about that? Well, again, it's a kind of resentment of the success of science in some sense. Why Popper actually held that is not so clear from his biography. It's perhaps just a wish to be shocking. Yes, that's Stowe certainly attributed to a number of philosophers, so-called great philosophers, a wish to be looked deep and shocking, and hence become famous when they didn't really have good reasons for what they said.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this was something you wanted to bring in. I mean, and I sort of overlooked this. I mean, Stove's philosophy in terms of his philosophical contributions are there's many regarding rationality and the philosophy of induction. And you wanted to include this question of, as you mentioned there, why the theory for Stove, why the theory of logical probability is so crucial to rationality.
Yeah. So let me try and explain that very briefly. As we've said, Stowe was mainly a negative thinker and argues on what's wrong with various received ideas, but he did have a positive contribution to make in defending against Popper and those kind of people, a theory of logical probability. So Stowe thought that much of the irrationalism of Popper, Kuhn and others in the philosophy of science was due to the error that he called deductivism, which is the theory that the only logic is deductive logic. That means deductive logic means logic where the conclusions follow with certainty from the premises, like in the traditional syllogism. However, in science, in courts of law, and in historical research and so on, evidence nearly always falls short of certainty. It's probabilistic. But that's logic too, according to Stowe, and following, in effect, the theory of Keynes' treatise of probability. If you don't admit the objectivity of non-deductive logical relations, you'll undermine the rationality of the vast majority of human researchers. So he says, you've got to go back and take seriously probabilistic logic, the logic of confirmation of how evidence, for example, in a court of law, whether evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt the guilt of the accused. So the law assumes that is an objective fact, whether the evidence does in fact prove beyond reasonable doubt the guilt of the accused. And the phrase proof beyond reasonable doubt is explicitly means less than absolute certainty. So it's something probabilistic. The jury is not allowed to ask, does it mean 90% or something? They're not supposed to be numerical about it. But nevertheless, it's probabilistic logic. And Stowe says you really need to study that seriously to defend rationality in science and anywhere else.
Does that, I'm sure this is probably a question Stowe got put to him a lot, though. How does that work in relation to philosophy and not
yeah, it's not quite
such
the same
empirical matters as law.
That's right. It does. That's right. That's not quite that. Yeah, philosophy is different. Philosophical arguments are not exactly probabilistic, or very rarely. They're about conceptual analysis, and where they're not about that, they probably are deductive, and it's a matter of intuition. Maybe it's closer to mathematical argument. So yes, he doesn't say that getting straight probabilistic reasoning, probabilistic logic is going to sort out philosophy. That's a different kind of reasoning.
Okay. But okay, so it's just crucial to sort of rationality and rationalism.
Yeah, in the normal sense of drawing correct conclusions from factual evidence in law, in common sense, getting around the world, law and science. Yeah, experimental science especially. Okay,
that makes sense. Okay, well, sort of, as I said, I studied continental philosophy and my basis was, Kant and onwards, and I spent a lot of time with Kant. So reading Stowe on the German idealists that he tackles, such as Kant and Hegel, was funny. It was probably the hardest I've laughed at philosophical texts for a long time. And it was very refreshing because Kant and all these figures get taken basically as sort of royalty in the philosophical sphere.
Yeah.
But it's
perhaps he wasn't 100% fair, but anyway, that's a good read.
Yeah, maybe not. But what was really funny for me, this first question here was that Stove takes Kant right at his the real kernel of Kant's thought, especially in the Critique of Pure Reason. How are synthetic a priori? Blimey, I've forgotten it myself.
Truths.
Truths possible.
How is the synthetic? How is it possible?
Yeah. And Stove basically says this would be completely fine if Kant hadn't put the word "how" in there. And why is this such a huge problem for Stove?
Yes, Stove says that modal questions like how is something or other possible, or how is there knowledge possible or something, don't have answers because they're just necessarily true. So you don't ask how is 1 + 1 possibly equal to 2. It just is equal to 2 and necessarily so. And there aren't further questions about how it's possible. If you try to ask that sort of question, Stove says, you just dig yourself into a philosophical hole and start talking nonsense because you're asking a question that doesn't have an answer.
So, and this also stands true for questions such as how is nature possible? How is space possible?
Yes, that's right. So space has properties that geometry and physics are going to tell you about, but there isn't a further problem about how it's possible. That's a modal question that is a wrong question, as if it's a kind of logical question. So yeah, space, it's, there's a scientific study of space, but that's all there is about space.
I see what I mean. So saying it's possible is almost like as if you're saying like we don't even know if it exists, but we clearly do, but we need to then define what that actually is that we're talking about.
That's right. But there's no question left over after you've said everything scientific about space. So you're just trying to ask yourself a non-question if you ask on top of that, how is it possible?
Yeah, okay. And of course, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's finished.
Well, I was going to say from that, I mean, of course, for Kant, from this, the a priori reality of space and time for man as the two things which are already there as the basis of our experience. Really, for Kant, this is the phenomenal reality, and from this he posits the noumenal reality, the thing in itself, or the reality that we don't have access to. And this for Stove in all forms, Locke, Kant. I guess you can't say this of Hume, really, because Hume eventually, with his sort of radical skepticism, just says, well, we just don't know. But this general philosophical notion of some external world, for Stove, is really the absolute, this is really something we never, we don't have the right.
Gone down that.
Yeah.
Yeah, shouldn't have gone down that path. So Stove says that the Cartesian problem of how to get out of your consciousness to grasp the real world behind the appearances is a mistake, and one of the kind driven by language mistakes. We just, he says, perceive things directly, as studied by science, and we know that. We know we perceive things. And if you once start thinking that you're trapped inside behind a veil of appearances, you'll never fight your way out. He says, don't go down that path. Don't start there.
Did he have any sympathy for that, for any form of your sort of idealistic thought?
No, he thought that, I think, idealism of one kind or another was the original sin of the so-called great philosophers of modern times. He's probably, why isn't there idealism before Descartes? There isn't. Maybe there's Indian idealism, but we did without it in ancient times, he thinks, so we can do without it now. So the Plato cult was largely an attack on idealist tendencies. He thinks he's got no sympathy with that at all. It's all wrong.
So just out of interest, how would he read something such as Plato's Cave?
I'm not sure of the answer to that.
Okay.
Because he did seem, although he studied with his teacher John Anderson, the famous philosopher in Australia, a great deal of Plato, I don't think he was a great sympathizer with Plato, even of the simpler dialogues. I can't answer that.
Okay. So, and as I understand it, Stove wasn't a religious man.
No, that's right. He was fascinated by religion, and he thought atheism was the obvious truth. Unlike many atheists, he wasn't too sure that was a good thing. He said that Beattie, David Hume's opponent in the question of atheism, was absolutely right to say that atheism was no use as consolation when you were sick and dying. So in a sense, I think David Stove would have liked, in a sense, if religion was true, but he didn't find it in the least probable.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was just thinking, in relation to philosophy of idealism, whether or not there was any sympathies for even, theology or something like that. But basically, in short, there's no higher, there's no beyond, there's no above for stuff.
That's right. We're just land mammals, a little bit smarter than the rest.
But I mean, it's always interesting to see the thinkers who do agree and accept that isn't, on a day-to-day basis, the most practical or the best perspective to have.
Yes, that's right. He felt probably some kind of loss of a religious or a higher perspective. It's just that he thought you couldn't possibly believe in it.
Do you mind if I ask, are you a religious man?
Yes, I'm a Catholic myself. My other things, I'm editor of the Journal of the Australian Catholic Historical Society.
That's really interesting. So did you and Stove ever get into heated debates?
Well, no. I'm not a heated debate kind of person, I must say. If I was in the room with three geniuses, I wouldn't be telling them what was wrong with them. I'd be just listening and thinking either they got this right or they got this wrong, but I don't do that. He was quite respectful of Catholics and understood that they had some reasons for what they thought. And he did say that I and another Catholic student of his called Peter Forrest, now a professor of philosophy, were smart guys. We just didn't have enough salt in the diet, as he put it, that we weren't skeptical enough of things that claims that were made by religions and others. Mm-hmm. And we thought we weren't skeptical enough. Mm-hmm. But we didn't. We were we were very respectful, and everything went fine.
Okay. And of course, this sort of question of another world, an external world, leads us really probably to the part of Stove's biography and philosophy, I guess, in a way, which made me laugh the most, which was his probably now infamous worst argument in the world competition, in which he won his own competition with his own argument, which if I recall, that this argument is also, somewhat tangential to the idea of a sort of a philosophical external.
That's right. It's an argument that leads to, in effect, idealist conclusions. So, well, it wasn't his argument. No, as you say, he ran a competition to find the worst argument in the world in 1986. And by that he meant an argument that was both logically really terrible and very widely accepted. And he awarded the prize to himself with this argument: we can know things only as they're related to us, or under our forms of perception and understanding, or insofar as they fall under our conceptual schemes, etc. Therefore, we cannot know things as they are in themselves. Now, maybe at first glance that sounds too abstract to be common, but in fact, lots of cultural relativism and general wokeness is based on an assumption that our views are determined by our education, cultural privilege, brain chemistry, or what have you, and therefore we can't get outside of that to the truth about the world. So we should ditch white male science that thinks it's uniquely rational, etc., etc. So I'm sure in your travels in the humanities world, you've seen instances of that kind of thinking, probably not put as a very specific argument. It's more an assumption that our thinking is determined by something or other, like that's been imposed on us by history, by culture, etc. And therefore we don't take it seriously. We think that it's not getting at the truth. We think it's not anything else is getting at the truth as well, because it's just more stuff, more things imposed on us. Well, that argument is just invalid. And you can see, if you look at it, what's laid out there, it doesn't follow. Sure, we can find things, know things in themselves. He puts a parallel argument, if I remember it rightly. You can see even more definitely, more easily is wrong, that if you argue we can eat oysters only under the gastronomic and culinary conditions of eating oysters, therefore we can never eat oysters in themselves. I mean, that was just farcical. And the one about knowledge is no better.
Okay, I mean that's a fascinating. That's a really clever sort of use of the the propositions regarding idealism onto basically the current, should we say, synthesis of social reality and philosophical, into this culture of wokeness. So really, this argument is the one which denies of ever being truth, capital T truth, because all truth is relative to, oh, you grew up in this time with this skin color and you're male, so it's
right.
Wrong.
Yeah, so it's replacing reasons with causes. It says that your reasons, what you think your reasons for believing that something is true are actually causes that are imposed on you by something or other, whether brain chemistry or culture or anything else, and therefore there's no reason to believe them. But this is a false argument. I mean, it's like saying that if you put 3 + 5 in a calculator and it says 8, then that can't be right because there's electronic reasons that cause that. I mean, it's just, this is not right.
But I guess you end up in a complete a social and philosophical, well, not philosophical, but a socially infected philosophical impasse at that point where, well, if you carry on down that road, you're just going wrong. But ultimately, it's like a big sunk cost, right? Where they have to admit, look, we've just been doing junk philosophy for a long time. We need to go back.
That's right. Again, they shouldn't go back to philosophy. They should go back and join a science lab and see, or a mathematics school, and see how it's actually done to getting the truth.
Mm-hmm. And it's
you're quite right. There's a sunk cost problem that some people have spent their whole career, including undergraduate career, absorbing this kind of false argument, and they're not likely to get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess this sort of does move us into the other side of Stove's work, which he's also sort of known for, which is really one of the earliest, perhaps even not a critic of woke culture, because really, I wasn't around in the day, but I mean, was woke culture a thing? Did it have its own name in the day of Stove?
What was it? It did. It wasn't called that. Yeah, the words woke is a fairly recent word, and postmodernism only goes back to the 1980s or something. But I did, when I was an undergraduate at Sydney University with him in the early 1970s. Well, we had thought forms that are recognizably the same. Now, what did we call them? I think we called it French Marxism or Althusserianism or something like that. I can't remember. And before that, there were people who wanted to undermine the rationality of science and thinking generally were in favor of either Freud or Marx, both of whom had stories about how things were caused by your views were caused by your class position, or they were caused by your childhood trauma. Again, replacing reasons with causes and hence undermining the reasons. There must have been some golden age before all this happened. And it will before our time.
Yeah, probably. I think it was. What's it called? The Garden of Eden. I think it was.
That's right. Maybe it was when science had such a high profile in the 1950s, and everybody believed it.
I think the peak was probably Victorian era.
I suppose so. Yeah, you're probably right. The late 1800s.
Yeah. Then it all goes off.
You wouldn't want to live there, but actually, Stove said he would like to have lived in the Victorian era in a milieu something like Charles Darwin, where he thought there was a calm commitment to the life of the mind and rationality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what would, I guess maybe it's not so much too different, I guess, but do you think if Stove was alive today, he would just look at the academic scene, especially in the West, and just say, yeah, this is of no surprise?
Yes. I know what he would have said. He would have said, I told you so. So the kind of postmodernism and obsessions with women, race, and so on that he fought in the academy in the 1980s and fought to no avail have run rampant outside the academy in the decades since. Reverse discrimination and cancel culture. What do you expect from those ideas? It's all the same, except worse and more of it.
And what is its end? What's its common goal, or do you not think it actually has one?
Well, its common goal is power in the interests of moral vanity, I suppose you would say. People believe these things not only because they've got bad arguments, like the worst argument in the world, but because they have a moral vanity that thinks they're somehow on the side of the oppressed, like the old Marxists did when they were defending Stalin's crimes. They thought, oh, well, we're in favour of we're working for the oppressed workers, and people think that they're working in favour of oppressed blacks or something when they behave in these ways today. So you get a combination of power going to yourself, being in charge and becoming a dean or something in academic life, and believing you're somehow on the right side of history morally. It's a powerful combination. Nice work if you can get it. So you can't do it honestly, but you can do it.
The great irony of postmodernism is that they're the ones supposedly critiquing all hegemony, but they're silently creating their own hegemony of power.
Not so silently, I say, but they are, yes.
Well, they're managing it, though.
Yeah, they're doing it.
So why, maybe it's a very obvious question, but I mean, if Stove gets an opportunity to do it, he will jab at Marxism. And I mean, perhaps the Marxism of his day was a bit more apparent. I mean, after, 68 and that big shift, especially in France, and Althusser as well. I mean, it's funny that you mention Althusser. I mean, people who studied philosophically in the years that you did, they often mention Althusser, and he's a figure who's sort of fallen off, I think, a bit now, and would have been replaced now more with Foucault or some other French Marxist of some sort.
That's right, and Foucault is still alive.
Do you think for the way in which Stove would have viewed Marxism as in the day that he's jabbing it in his writing would be any different in the way that it's seen now?
Well, he thought that Marxism was the first, and in his time the most widespread, of attempts to cynically undermine the search for truth by saying it was only a device for the ruling class to oppress everyone else. So it wasn't itself the sole root of contemporary philosophy's problems, but the indulgence shown towards it by so many philosophers then was a sign of more to come in the way of giving up on the pursuit of truth.
So what did Stove identify as politically? Did he ever have a clear political affiliation?
Well, the more conservative available, that's what he was signing up to. So he was in the Cold War. He and he's one or two of his colleagues, like the distinguished Australian philosopher David Armstrong, were very much Cold War warriors and were uncompromising in terms of anything to do with the Soviet Union and international Marxism. So they were in favour of fighting a war in South Vietnam, for example. And they welcomed the fall of the Soviet Union, needless to say. So David Stove actually said that he wasn't very happy with the fall of the Soviet Union. He said, of course, it's a great thing, but things will only get worse. He did have a bit of a depressive personality, I have to say. He said that it'll be replaced by chaos in Eastern Europe and Russia. And he was a little surprised, I think, that things went so well at least in Eastern Europe.
I was going to ask this. I mean, obviously, you spent a lot of time with him, and you might get the impression from our conversation so far that he was cold and, as you say, a bit depressive and cynical. But I mean, what was he like just to hang out with?
He was rather a warm-hearted person, and he was known for being rather supportive of students, even some that disagreed with him somewhat politically. If he saw talent in somebody, an ability to think well philosophically, he'd go out of his way to praise what they'd done. There are quite a lot of students of his who remember that well, I think. And he was a conversational sort of person. He'd argue, but he didn't argue in a overbearing sort of a way. He didn't have that kind of personality. he's was certainly good in that way.
Okay. Well, there's one thing, because I think a lot of people might then look up David Stove from this, or if they know of him, they might have seen the Wikipedia page, which really is a very quick paragraph on his work, and then there's a controversy section. So I feel that we should bring in the, probably, I don't know, maybe this is his most infamous essay, or the one that people, if they search his name, this is going to come up, I imagine, The Intellectual Capacity of Women, where he seeks to prove once and for all, as clear as day, that men are obviously smart, commonly smarter than women. And I mean, I guess my question is, why did Stove not write this, but why did he feel the need to write this? Because because it seems that the argument itself isn't of what's of importance. What's of importance for him is our avoidance of something which is obvious.
Yes, that's right. He thought that claims for the intellectual equality of men and women were dishonest, because they ignored the obvious reasons for thinking the opposite. So that the claim of equality was just an initial commitment demanded of everyone and not a conclusion from the evidence. So what he says is that normally you judge a thing's capacity by its behaviour in a wide range of circumstances. Well, women have achieved less at the highest levels of intellectual endeavour in a wide range of historical circumstances, and therefore the evidence, as far as it goes, is that their capacity is less on average. And if feminists claim that there has been a near total conspiracy up till now to prevent women reaching their intellectual potential, well, there's something to be said for that. It could be a defensible reply, but it only makes sense as a reply if you admit that the original argument had some force. What he objects to is that the original argument from performance to capacity, obvious as it is suppressed, and you're not allowed to say that.
So what would really be the purpose of equality then? What's the purpose of this equality then for women in that sense? Power.
Why are people insisting that you can't say that women could be different in intelligence? Well, they must, since they haven't allowed you to put the reasons on the table, there must be something that they're doing. And obviously it's a kind of moral vanity in thinking that they're standing on the side of women by suppressing argument about the question. So it's a moral reason, similar to the Marxist reasons for suppressing Stalin's crimes on the grounds that it might prevent them doing what they think they need to do on behalf of the oppressed workers. But Stove, of course, thinks that it doesn't support anyone to suppress obvious reasons for one thing or another. You should have free debate and allow the reasons to come to light, and then you can say what you think about them and give reasons for and against.
So where, I mean, I'm interested, I guess, is, as you said, it's all a little bit cold and cynical so far. Where did Stove find enjoyment?
In cricket. You Americans may not know much about cricket.
I'm UK.
UK, yes. But yes. In cricket, he was a cricket player himself, and he enjoyed gardening as well. He had a property in the semi-rural area, and he very much enjoyed that, even though it meant a very long trip to work. Family as well. So I guess you'd say the simple domestic pleasures, and that the ancient Romans and somebody like David Hume approved, nothing too spectacular. So I can't see him enjoying the pleasures of drugs or something.
No, not as a conservative, no. So there's such a sort of strange, I guess, assemblage of Stove's philosophy. Where would you advise people to begin?
As you mentioned, I think you should start with Cricket versus Republicanism. If you have $5 to spare, you can buy on Amazon a Kindle of his book, Cricket versus Republicanism, which has his main polemical essays. It doesn't matter if some of your audience are American and doesn't know what cricket is. That's just the short title essay. And if you don't have $5, you can go to the David Stove website where a number of essays are available free. I might recommend starting with the essay, Why Have Philosophers? But anything that whose title takes your fancy will work. So best wishes with reading him. I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, James Franklin. I mean, is there anything you would like to add about the work of David Stove, or even your own work that you feel we haven't covered?
No, I think we've covered everything. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that seems then like a good place to finish up. James Franklin, thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me.